have to unlearn government speak.
Oh
You
my
know,
gosh.
that's why the biggest challenge. It's like, okay, even when we talk about religious freedom and everything I've said is very much in line with the
Yeah.
way kind of we did this work in the government, but that's not how, say, faith leaders, they don't silo themselves into international versus domestic or sort of religious freedom versus everything else.
Yeah.
Like religious actors care about everything from climate change to women's rights to health care, youth.
Hello, welcome to the Head of the Table podcast. I'm your host, Nora Riddle. I'm a former policy advisor, former chief of staff in corporate America, and your advisor on all things leadership. And today we have a special guest with us. I would like to welcome Sameer Hossain. I would love to have you introduce yourself.
Hi, Nora, and hi, listeners, viewers, and fans of the Head of the Table podcast. I'm one of them. And so, again, my name is Sameer Hossain, and I'm a lawyer by training. You know, there aren't enough of those in the national capital area.
Oh,
So,
plenty.
but my lifelong passion and interest has been international human rights, civil rights, civil liberties, and that's what took me to study at the Howard University School of Law, specifically here in DC. And then I ended up, for the past 2 decades, really working in the US federal government as a policy advisor. Nora and I worked together at the US Department of State's Office of International Religious Freedom. And then I, in my final year, was at the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships as a senior policy advisor. So much of my career was involved with engaging faith-based stakeholders domestically and around the world to help inform U.S. foreign policies and domestic policies, and I was very passionate about that work. And that led me to my current endeavor. I'm a public policy and security consultant. I have my own practice called Pathfinder Policy Strategies, LLC. And I also have a companion podcast called the Pathfinder Pod. So I'm dabbling in this arena as well, and kind of look forward to having conversation with you today and also learning from you in this field. But I actually have a question for you.
You already have a
I
question
have
for
a
me.
question
Oh
for
my
me,
gosh,
as I
this is
think
unprecedented.
podcasters have to do that. So
Yeah.
since we both have podcasts, would this be considered a crossover initiative, perhaps?
Yeah.
I know your last guest was also a podcaster. But since I'm asking a question, would this be like a podcast within a podcast, perhaps? Like
Podcast
conception?
session, yeah.
Exactly. We've coined it
Maybe
here
it is.
on the Head
Maybe
of
it
the
is.
Table.
Yeah. You heard it here, folks.
But please.
No, thank you so much for joining us. It's really an honor to not only have the opportunity to previously work with you, but to cross paths in this new era. I feel like it's been honestly one of those unique things about where Washington, D.C. is right now, where people who have maybe previously worked together are now kind of in a new space. Maybe they're doing consulting, podcasting, content creation, and they're able to kind of work with each other in a new capacity, which has been such an honor. But I would love to hear, you talked a lot about how you spent, a couple of decades working on international religious freedom. I'd love to hear about what kind of drew you to the field, particularly international religious freedom and security.
Sure, absolutely. So I started my career at the U.S. Department of Defense as an analyst. I was focusing on South Asia initially, and then the career kind of went in a completely different direction. And it was shortly after 9/11, and what I was being asked was to help explain kind of what was happening in the world and contribute to the analysis and eventually inform U.S. foreign policy. And there was a bit of a gap, I would say. I think there was this understanding that there were a number of groups and individuals who were purportedly acting on their religious beliefs and engaging in violent activities. And people were trying to unpack that. And the gap that I saw is there wasn't this understanding of religion in this space. The US government, we like to say there's a separation of church and state. So you weren't necessarily delving into religious beliefs and ideologies. You're more talking about kind of the actions, right, of people. And here it was violence. And what I realized is there's this concept of religious literacy, especially from the government perspective, where you have to understand what drives and motivates people, what inspires them. And so in my role, what I was doing was I was bringing in faith leaders, and certainly in this space, religious scholars who were explaining from their perspective how they saw that violent extremists weren't necessarily doing things in line with, their interpretation of religion. They were saying these people are actually violating a lot of our own beliefs. And so I think that helped inform policymakers. It's opening the field of who can partner with you, who is actually along with you in this effort to keep the world safe, to keep our country safe. And so it wasn't necessarily like a religious freedom angle, but it was more so engaging faith actors to help improve our national security policies and keep everyone safe. And so I ended up taking a break to go to law school, and then that's where I was recruited by the Office of International Religious Freedom. I came in through the Presidential Management Fellow Program, and the office, when they interviewed me, was very interested in my background in national security, in law, and then also that kind of faith engagement space that I had kind of gotten thrust into after 9/11. So I think all of that came together when I was, approached by this office, and I found their work very, very fascinating. It's actually how I learned about the office, is when I actually interviewed for the position.
Yeah, it's that's funny. I also learned about the office when I interviewed for the position. For those listeners who maybe are less familiar with the kind of nature of departments in DC, they're quite large, and because the organizational structure of these departments often kind of grows as we see needs develop. You're not always going to know every office that exists within a department. And so I think the Office of International Religious Freedom was one, well, technically still exists to this day, as far as I'm aware, is one of those offices that kind of came into being to address certain issues and maybe isn't as well known, but works throughout the interagency to work on these really complex issues and engage a lot of different stakeholders. I did want to kind of go back to something you were saying of how like international religious freedom isn't necessarily the same thing you worked on whenever you're with DoD. I'd love to break down kind of what international religious freedom is in practice.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I want to borrow from one of our former principals that we worked under, Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback. He would like to say that when the US government advances religious freedom around the world, what we're doing is we're making sure that everyone has the right to religious freedom everywhere, all the time, and just without exception, essentially. And I think it also reminds me of a quote of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that we're all very familiar with, which is no one is free until all of us are free. So I think that was the guiding principle when it came to the practical application of religious freedom. It is protected in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. In the international space, there's instruments that obligate states to protect the right of everyone to practice their freedom of religion or belief. I think as I was working on it, I was trying to think about, and this is largely guided by the work of the office, it's what is the role of governments? Why do they have restrictions on the free exercise of religion, and for someone to not practice a religion or change their religion? What is the hesitation there? The other piece of it is, why are societies not accepting of um, that same freedom, or respecting someone else's faith or belief or lack of religion that doesn't reflect their own? And so when you start asking those questions of yourself as you do this work, you start to understand why the world looks the way it does. In the office, we would talk about perhaps like four-fifths of the world lives under severe restrictions on religious freedom, and for various reasons, various shapes and forms. But I think once you start to unpack those questions, you get to the crux of, it's complex. There's many, many different reasons, and you start to fine tune it. There's a lot of nuance, and you, as part of the U.S. government, you have access to governments, to societies, NGOs, faith leaders, information, and you have the resources at your hand and the experts that you work with to unpack that. And then in that practical space, you really pick at sort of what is the challenge here, what are the opportunities, what are the resources, and it's a collaborative effort across the U.S. government and across all those other stakeholders that I mentioned to make sure we move the needle and make sure everybody's able to practice freely and certainly get into why that's important.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that really well put view of the many different facets to international religious freedom. And I really liked also how you kind of related it back to, why does this matter to US citizens? I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a very important discourse going on right now because ultimately, a lot of the work that is being done by the US government is always through that lens of how are we benefiting US citizens. And I always found my time in the International Religious Freedom Office like so interesting and really helped me look at my like civil service and work that I was doing from a different lens because particularly in international religious freedom, I mean, you're representing so many different religions and you're really representing the plethora of beliefs that exist in the US. And you're trying to figure out how do we not only kind of protect the rights of our citizens, but you're also looking at, how do we provide that same opportunity for other people? Because, you know, we are fortunate to live in a country where our rights are largely protected, but not everyone has that opportunity. I'd love to kind of go back to this connection between international religious freedom and like security, national security. I know you said you kind of found yourself falling into the position,
Yeah.
but then you've really spent so many years in that space. I'd love to learn more about that connection.
Yeah, I think the again, going back to that post 9/11 era, a lot of governments, including our own, was looking at what is the role in religion and kind of these violent extremist ideologies that are resulting in violent actions. And I think that that makes the national security hook very clear. I think as I transitioned over to the Office of International Religious Freedom, what I was hearing from other governments is if we let everyone be free and do whatever they want and believe whatever they want, then we can't control the pathway to radicalization followed by potentially violent extremism. And I felt like that was looking at it kind of in a very sort of narrow way. Like, because this might happen, we need to restrict all of it. And what that was doing is it was actually having a counterproductive effect. Like, if you wanted to keep people safe and secure and keep things stable and peaceful, it almost seemed like you're doing the opposite of what you ought to be doing, which is protect everyone's individual rights, all of their human rights, including freedom of religion or belief. And what that does is, and I want to focus on the positive now, it's people then feel like they can be them, truly be themselves, what motivates them, what their foundational principles are, what makes them feel as part of a bigger community, and then their relationship with the government. So instead of having grievances against the government because they can't practice their truly held core beliefs, they now see the government as protecting those beliefs. So the government is a partner in this, right? And the government is upholding their end of the bargain with respect to protecting individual rights. And then what that does is then it opens up the space for people to then engage with society and feel like they are part of that society because the government is protecting everyone's right to practice. They're part of society, then they're contributing, and then, you have this cohesive societal interaction. And then the next step is prosperity. People then can contribute in a way that benefits everyone. And I think it's hard to statistically prove that. I know a lot of scholars have looked into this, and it's hard to prove a negative. Like, if you don't have religious freedom, then this is what's going to happen. But I think there are many anecdotal um, sort of example, certainly from my own experiences, but if you just go around and listen to people's stories from around the world, once their rights are protected, you just have a world of opportunity after that for everyone. And again, all of society and countries benefit from that and prosper as a result while keeping everyone safe. So I think that's the what I observed and learned and now like truly believe based on my work in the Office of International Religious Freedom. And so national security, when it comes to governments, it's always a piece of that conversation. It's like, how does this relate to that very important priority that all governments have?
Yeah, and I think you touched on something we've covered before on this podcast from kind of the economic lens about the social
Mm-hmm.
contract. And so often, we think about the social contract in like a very specific way of looking at like our laws, but we don't always think about it from a like positive perspective of if we have these rights insured, then it's actually preventative. And so, like a lot of times with the social contract, like the idea is that the government is may take away some of your rights to protect you, but I don't think we always think about it from a perspective of if the government is ensuring other parts of your rights, then you are going to feel more engaged in a society. You're going to feel more engaged in a country, in a community. And so ultimately, I think that international religious freedom kind of plays into the social contract theory in a really
Yes.
interesting way, especially as we've seen kind of this crossover of radicalization and also lack of economic opportunity
Right.
kind of come together for a very nasty storm.
Yes, exactly. No, I think that's very well put. And I think um, when people feel like their rights are protected, religious freedom and other rights, in our system, First Amendment covers freedom of religion, but also freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to petition your government. It's like a bundled set of rights. And I think once you have that, and you even have that, a form of that around the world, people feel like they're accepted and respected and valued. And I think that's transformational. And I think you put a finer point on
Yeah, well, I'd kind of love to talk about, I know, a challenging aspect of international religious freedom work, and that is the many, many stakeholders
that. Yes,
involved.
absolutely.
I know, you're having to work with the US government, other governments, faith-based leaders, NGOs. I mean, it runs the gamut. How, in your experience, have you found really successful ways to engage with a variety of different stakeholders?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I spent the entirety of my career kind of tackling that and fine tuning that and kind of learning and observing. I would say all the stakeholders that you mentioned. There's governments, and of course, when we were at the State Department, we were engaging one on one with diplomats of other countries. There are NGOs that are working in the space. Sometimes it's all international human rights that they focus on, or some of them are very specific to promoting international religious freedom. And then there's the faith leaders themselves. They have a stake in all of this. And some of it is because of the values they cherish and they want that for everyone. Others are also engaging because they're advocating for their fellow faith community members across the world. And then you have just individuals who care about these issues. They might not be part of an NGO or a faith community, but they're like, we want equal rights for everybody. And so I think you have to engage all of them. And I would say they're all critical to this. You have to engage and learn from them and their perspectives. They all have different equities. But I think the key is you have to put yourself in their shoes, right? So when I engage governments, I would ask those questions. I wonder why they feel like they have to have these restrictions and what would convince them to open up the space. When I talk to NGOs, they want access. They want to be able to go to countries and observe and report on these issues. They also want the U.S. government to do what they're, recommending in terms of policies, and they're always pushing. And I've always felt like that kept us honest. It's like, okay, yes, these are things we should always be thinking about, in addition to all of our other priorities, national security being one of the very top ones. And then with faith leaders, they really, especially in America, they want what they experience here, they want for everyone everywhere. And I think that kind of overlapped entirely with the Sam Brownback quote I said. It's like, we want this for everyone, everywhere, all of the time. And I think faith leaders were also very much in line with that concept. And then other individual stakeholders would bring cases to us, and that's often how we learned about a lot of these issues, whether someone had been in prison or disappeared, or just we're having like students. I remember I went to Pakistan and we met with a parent, and they were saying their child was bullied in school, and it was purely because of what faith the child was. And it was very disheartening to hear that, but at the same time, I felt motivated. It's like, well, we work with faith leaders and educators here in the US. Maybe there's an exchange of best practices that we can do. And certainly our role was to talk to the government about some of these issues. And we were able to present to the government what their own citizens were saying to us. And I felt like there was a very collaborative approach there, but engaging each of those individual stakeholders and actors in this space really helped inform our policies in a way to make them relevant and more effective in line with what our own objectives and mission were at the Office of International Religious Freedom, at the State Department, and the US government as a whole.
Thank you. I think that's a really good way of putting it, of like trying to keep that personal element to
Mm-hmm.
it, because also religion is so personal to everyone. And even if you were part of a church, a mosque, a community of people, religion is still kind of inherently personal.
Yes.
And so trying to balance kind of the personal challenges that individuals are facing while also supporting communities, supporting organizations that are trying to navigate a challenging space, and also like the many issues that governments are facing. I know in particular, there were some times that while international religious freedom was what we were working on, we were also having to balance the other like, political uh, issues that were going on in a country, in a region at the same time. These things don't live in a vacuum.
Exactly.
Well, I'd love to kind of hear a little bit about maybe some advice you would give to our listeners as you are trying to work collaboratively, as you're trying to build coalitions, how you can kind of balance the priorities and needs of everyone involved while still kind of staying focused on a larger mission.
Yes, absolutely. I think another great question. I think in terms of managing all those different stakeholders, where it's governments, NGOs, faith leaders, they all have their own equities. And the way I saw it is everyone has a role to play, and I'd like to believe we're all kind of going in the same direction. We all have separate lanes. Sometimes we share a lane, but we're all in our own specific lanes going towards the same thing, which is we want everyone to be safe. We want everyone's rights to be protected and do it in a way that's productive and constructive for everyone, right? These are complex issues, but I'd like to see it in that broader lens. And then, so what happens when some of those interests seem competing, that they don't seem like they're going in the same direction? Maybe they're head on with each other, right? So the way I saw it is you just, in my mind, there are these Venn diagrams, right? It's like Venn diagrams where you've got the governments, whether it's our government and our priorities, you've got the foreign government and their, own priorities and concerns and limitations on religious freedom. You've got the faith leaders, and then you've got the NGOs. And then I always believe there's that sweet spot in the middle where all of them overlap. And I think my role as a policy advisor and an analyst of these issues, it's like, where's that sweet spot? Let's start there. Where do the priorities line up, the aspirations, the objectives? Where can we find common ground? And I start there. And then you look at what is practical. So these are things we can do right now, or maybe they're already happening and we just have to uplift that. What is possible? So maybe we don't have it now, but because we're focusing on the sweet spot, we can actually do this if we put some effort into it, and certainly collaboratively. And I think the third piece of it is what's aspirational. And I think that's where, if you keep that long-term objective in mind, you can have that incremental progress, but over time have a huge positive influence. And I think I felt like if I could sort of compartmentalize things in my own brain in that way, it made sense. Like, okay, you've got all these different players, they're all bringing all these different issues. It seems like one big jumble, but as you start to bucket some of these overlapping issues, it makes a lot of sense. And I found clarity, and I felt like since I'd spent 2 decades in the government, I had that longevity to say, hey, we started here and look at where we've come. And I would say overall, it's been very, very positive, because these things take time, and I'm glad to see the things that have come to fruition compared to where I started.
Yeah. I think I really liked the part where you were talking about how you're balancing a variety of needs. Sometimes they're hitting head on.
Yeah,
But the thing that I noticed is you were never talking about something. You were specifically trying to take charge and just say, this is the direction we need to go.
exactly. I know.
It's like incorporating all of the needs and priorities, and maybe sometimes having to say, okay, we're not going to focus on one issue set, we're going to kind of go a slightly different direction so that we're supporting as many people as possible. But I think that's really a skill set that we've talked a little bit about on this podcast when you're thinking about leadership. It's not just you necessarily have the best idea, and maybe you do have the best idea, but it's really trying to incorporate the many like people within a space, because all of these faith leaders, NGOs, governments, I mean, these people have been also working in this space for a really long
Yes.
time. And I know the International Religious Freedom Office was kind of this unique opportunity to bring in this collection of what kind of felt like a hodgepodge like group of people. Like you kind of felt like the collection of underdogs in like a superhero movie sometimes. But it was still this really cool opportunity to really highlight so many different voices that ultimately did kind of have the same end game.
Yes, I mean that's a perfect Marvel reference there. I like to see things as the Justice League as a Superman fan, but I felt like everyone in our office had different superpowers, but when you combine them, we really did some amazing things. And it really proves that when religious freedom, you had mentioned like these issues don't exist in a vacuum, and that's absolutely right. But I feel like if you have an office and a set of experts dedicated to that topic, you give it its due.
Yep.
You do that deep dive on countries, on issues, and then that then fits into the bigger piece, whether it's other human rights or in the national security and foreign policy realm, and then just the whole world in general, and the interdependence of a lot of these issues, whether it's the rights and how they are interdependent, or how countries and global citizens are interdependent. And these things all affect us. And I feel like the way you mentioned it captures how you really need to have that broad set of expertise to kind of focus on this issue and then branch out from there as well. So it's kind of like a two-way thing. So I like the way you described it.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's one like a very similar thing to the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues that I used to work in, where a lot of people were kind of asking, well, why do we have thematic offices that are focusing on a certain issue set, but then also we have regions, and that's where issues do not exist in a vacuum, but we also still have to address those other issues at the same time that we are addressing these issues that are kind of all encompassing. And I like to think about it as kind of like when you're in school, there are going to be classes that are going to kind of overlap with other issue sets. And the reason that you develop out like a specific class on an issue is because it's so cross cutting that you need to look at, for example, instead of looking at international religious freedom from an economic perspective, you really need to look at international religious freedom and how it intersects with the economy, how it intersects with a specific country's political dynamic. You have to look at how people, relate international religious freedom and gender, international religious freedom and race. Like these things overlap. And a lot of why these offices were created is because there kind of needed to be someone working on it from both perspectives, because someone is going to be working on, for example, like our economic relations with Pakistan, but like that is not going to cover international religious freedom and religious freedom within Pakistan, because that's just such a large issue to work on. And so I'm glad that there are experts in the field that are kind of now, transitioning. I know that you're no longer with the US government, so I'd love to kind of hear how that transition's going. Tell us about building out a consulting business. I'd love to learn more.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I like to say I'm on the other side of the equation now. I throughout my career I worked with NGOs and nonprofits, and it was more of an opportunity to learn from them and to be responsive to them. As a representative of the U.S. government, you had to make sure that when you were listening to what the American public was telling you, that you were translating that into a response that was, an action that they were kind of inquiring about, right, rather than just taking notes and moving on. Now being on the other side, where I'm in the midst of civil society, and my role now is to advise them on how to navigate the public policy space, and also do it in a way where they're safe, and kind of mitigate some of the threats that exist out there. It's really interesting. It's a different world. I think that certainly the skills that I developed in government are very informative in the work I do. The issues that I care about, how I approach problem solving, the people that I respect and admire, that I want to work with, was all shaped by my time in government. So that has actually helped me hit the ground running as I've transitioned into kind of the business world and kind of working on this consulting practice. But I feel like there's a lot of overlap. It's just a different side of the coin, in terms of the approach. I'm still learning, but I feel like I found my footing because of that training I received in government, but also really honing in on what I feel passionate about and what I find personally meaningful.
I'm excited to hear that the transition's going well. I think it's always a little terrifying. So the episode that we'll release before this one, we will be talking about kind of going from an expert in one field to being a beginner in another field.
Mm-hmm.
And while there are certainly so many skill sets that kind of transfer over, it's also quite terrifying.
Yes.
Because I think the last time most of us were beginners was in coming out of college, maybe coming out of law school, and you're much more comfortable at that time in your life,
Yeah.
being new at something.
Yeah, everything's new.
Whereas like if you've done something for say, 10, 20 years, it's new can feel quite unsettling.
Yeah.
And especially in a time where there's so much change. So it's
Yeah, I would say you and I have both, I'm sure, have had to find a way to reinvent ourselves, right? And certainly there's this public aspect of it, but then also when I speak to people, I have to unlearn government speak.
oh my gosh.
That's why the biggest challenge. It's like, okay, even when we talk about religious freedom and everything I've said is very much in line with the way kind of we kind of did this work in the government, but that's not how, say, faith leaders, they don't silo themselves into international versus domestic or sort of religious freedom versus everything else.
Yeah.
Like religious actors care about everything from climate change to women's rights to health care, youth. And so while we came at it singularly from the religious freedom lens, they do, I talked about religious freedom everywhere all the time for everyone. They do everything everywhere all of the time. And it's like, wow, I have this deep appreciation of how complex their work is, right? Whereas we were very kind of narrow in our issue set. So it's been a steep learning curve, but I'm just amazed by it. And there's just so much opportunity there.
Yeah, I really like how you kind of frame that as, faith leaders are not looking at this from international religious freedom solely. Like they're supporting their community.
Yes.
And there are so many different community members who are part of a religion, whatever your religion or non-religion may be.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many different needs within that. And similar to you, as I've kind of transitioned into kind of portfolio work where you're looking at how do I work with organizations, maybe you're working one-on-one with people. Like I've kind of worked on a career coaching business where I'm hoping to like work one-on-one with people to advance in their career. It's just a very different type of like voice that you are using. And especially for those of us who have been in government for a while or even been in the private sector representing an organization, finding your own voice is quite an interesting process.
Yes. Oh man, that's the biggest thing I'm focusing on now. And I've kind of honed in on authenticity. And so, what is it? In government, you're always a representative of the US government. Yes, when in our personal capacity, we have First Amendment rights to speak freely, but there's variances, depending on your role in government, your position, your responsibilities. So you're always careful. You don't want to conduct yourself in a way or say things that kind of would reflect poorly on being someone in the US government and kind of your responsibility to pursue the best for the American people. I don't have to think about that anymore. Now it's more like, well, what is it that I bring to the table? What motivates me? What's my approach to problem solving? What do I care about? And then really honing in on what are my principles? Like, what is it that I am zeroing in on? And so my podcast is actually focused on a principled approach to problem solving. And I start with this quote from President Jimmy Carter where he said, times change, but principles don't. And I think that's where I've kind of just really dedicated myself to exploring that and what that means. And I think that's very different than how we did things in government. It wasn't about you, it was about the mission, the objectives, and the American people. Now it's like, who am I when it comes to these issues? What is the unique perspective? And honestly, it's been liberating. It's like I'm getting to explore and find my voice. And I think this podcast platform is amazing because you can, talk to your, if it's former colleagues or even people who are in the space right now and really exchange ideas in a way that is new to me, and it's been fascinating.
Yeah, I've absolutely loved that part of just like getting honestly getting to feel a little bit like I was in college again, where I just get to like have conversations about issue sets that I'm really passionate about, that I'm currently working on or want to work on. And I think that's a big reason I leaned into a podcast is because when I was laying on this couch, kind of thinking, what do I want to do next? Immediately, my reaction was, well, I don't really want to stop what I'm doing, but maybe I just have to do it in a different way. And a podcast is kind of a great opportunity to create your own platform,
Yeah.
to represent views. And like, I didn't want to stop working on women's economic empowerment because, over 50% of the population are women. And I really believe that economic opportunities can open doors for people and really create a better world.
Absolutely, 100% agree.
I
I
haven't
agree with your take,
I haven't
100%.
I haven't had anyone counter economic prosperity
Right.
so far.
But I
So
think I think not everyone unpacks it the way you've done it, and I think that's the benefit of having worked specifically from the human rights and certainly kind of from the global women's issues perspective. That then you can then inform others about how this is all interconnected.
yeah, I'd be curious to kind of learn more of what is like really different as you're going beyond your voice of kind of fully transitioning into private sector from government where you're in a world of acronyms and there's a lot of bureaucracy that you're navigating.
Yeah, I think it's different when you're not there as a representative of an entity. I think if I had gone to the private sector, there would have been a little bit more overlap. It's like, okay, well now I represent this company and its ethos and its
Right.
objective and mission. Being solo, you kind of have to figure out, well, I'm a consultant, so it's more leaning into what my clients want to do and want to kind of pursue. But at the same time, as an independent kind of problem solver, I'm able to pick and choose from everywhere. Here's some best practices I learned from government. Here's some things that I've learned from civil society. Here's some things that, because of the times we live in, I feel like we need to have novel solutions to the problems we face today. And it's like you have, like you said, it almost feels like you're in college again. You're learning all these things, but I think it also is a responsibility. You can't just be an undeclared major in this space.
True.
It all has to work towards something, and I think that's the hard part of it. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, here are all the people I have access to. Here are the resources. Here are the problems. What is that new Venn diagram? And I think that sweet spot is going to be very fluid, especially when you're thinking in the short term. But as you think long term, you want to make sure it's connected. It's like whatever I'm doing now should be building towards something. And I
Right.
think that's both the challenge and the exciting piece of being on the outside and doing my own thing.
Yeah, I could not agree more. Well, I kind of want to transition to the period. I'd love to hear, in the podcast, we kind of bring people on and we get to hear their perspective,
Yeah,
but also get their advice. And
sure.
I'd love to hear what is one piece of advice you would give to our viewers that are maybe like just starting out their career, and in turn, kind of maybe one piece of advice you'd want to give yourself as you were starting out your career.
Yes. The advice I would give to current leaders and aspirational leaders is really think about that principled approach that I was referencing. It's like what is your kind of foundation here where it comes to personal values, motivations, and what you're really going to stick to no matter what. And I think that's why that quote from Jimmy Carter is so inspirational. It's like times change, principles don't. He was very focused on human rights and justice and just overall kindness, right? And I would say, and I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit, when you, Nora, on your podcast talk about leadership, I think some of the naysayers might say, well, we all know this, it's common sense. Or they'll say, you're not telling us anything we don't already know. But I think real wisdom is very straightforward. It's consistently implementing what you already know is what's nearly impossible. And I think we all need to deeply reflect personally on what these, you know, nuggets of wisdom and the guidance you're providing, really means for each of us individually. So when you're on your couch or you're at the grocery store or running, listen to Head of the Table and then come home and think about how you're actually going to implement that. And I think that's where conversations like this help us kind of explore what all of that means. But for me, the way I've described it is have a principled approach, practice kindness. The stress management, episode was so important. And I think anyone could just listen to me like, yeah, of course. But as a leader, how do you make sure you're not adding to people's stress?
Absolutely.
Right?
It's
That's
so
hard.
it's so hard, and I like that you brought that up in particular, where a lot of times we think about, oh, well, I want to manage my stress, or I want to take actions, I want to take these principled approaches, and we think about it through the lens of maybe just ourself, but we're not thinking about, we don't live in a vacuum. And so we're impacting everyone around us, whether we're a leader at work or you're simply interacting with people, on the metro, around in the world, at the grocery store. How you interact with people impacts the environment you're in
Yes.
so much.
Right. And then as far as advice that I would give to me
Yeah.
20 years ago, I'd say follow your passions and the path will reveal itself. Seems like something that would go on a poster, but I would
Yeah. Feels
say
like it should be in a fortune cookie.
there might be like a unicorn involved and whatnot. But what I found is when I started, I had no idea where I was going. Absolutely not. I was totally winging it like that, fresh out of college or in college. Like you're just doing everything and learning about everything. But as I was thrust into the national security space and kind of where religion and religious actors fit into all of this, and then going to law school with purpose to say, okay, you know what? I've gone as far as I can go on my own. Now I want to really learn about these issues and become an expert. And then the Religious Freedom Office came about because they liked that background. And then all of a sudden things just fell into place, even though I certainly didn't have a plan. But I knew this is what I liked doing. This is what really kind of motivated me, got me out of bed every morning. And the people I met over the course of that time, it was just amazing. I was like, I'm working with my heroes, like I'm learning from them. And it's like, that was never part of my strategic, 25-year vision. It just happened. But the thing is, like, because I led with what I really cared about, those things kind of fell into place. And I think I wouldn't have, there's no way to know that in the beginning. It's
Oh
like,
no.
I might not like this, and who knows what I would do if I wasn't doing this. So I think, I hope that helps some folks who are certainly in a transition phase. It might not be reassuring, especially financially, to say, oh, I'm just going to do what I enjoy. Like, you still have bills to pay and, you have your career to think about, but I wouldn't discount kind of what really drives you. And I think I would give myself that advice 20 years ago, but I would also try to remind myself of that right now as well when we're kind of reinventing ourselves and going through the world right now.
Yeah, I really like that, because I was like taking notes and like, yes, I need to remember that, because it's it's almost like you're not completely starting over in your career, but it does feel like quite a pivot, and it does kind of elicit those same emotions of graduating, and you're excited and you're terrified and you sort of know what you're doing, but you sort of don't at the
Yeah,
same time. Well, I absolutely love that. Kind of speaking about, a lot of the proud moments you've had in your career. What is one of your proudest accomplishments?
I would say it was my final year in government. At the request of the White House, I was asked to help develop the U.S. national strategy to counter Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate. And so I served as a senior policy advisor in the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. And I feel like because of the skill sets I had to bring to the table, the expertise on how the US federal government works, my knowledge about domestic issues and even international issues, like how they intersect and are sort of very much related to what we experience here in the United States, the relationships I had with faith based communities, it like brought it all together. So I feel like that particular project, you know, from working on it from, the first draft all the way to publication and everything in between, I got to work with phenomenal people at the White House. You have access to every resource in the world and every expert. The folks there that I worked with, they leave no stone unturned. And so I learned a great deal from them. It's like, this is really how you deliver for the
Yeah.
American people. And then for me, it was like, it just brought the entirety of my career into one nice little box with a bow on it. It's
Yeah.
like apply everything you've ever learned and just do your best.
Yeah.
And I felt like, and I was also delivering for the people we work for. And so I would say that that really captured everything that I aspired to. Getting to work at the White House with phenomenal people and do this really important work. That which is about the strategy. It was intended for two communities listed in the title, but it really helps everyone. It's about
Yeah.
how you can certainly practice your faith freely here in the US and stay safe, but the tools and resources and certainly the government's responsibilities are all equally
Yeah.
applicable to everyone. And so that was another nice piece of that
Wow.
initiative.
Wow. Yeah. No, it's that's just so heartening to like hear of how you've had this great opportunity and will continue to still have great opportunities in your career, but kind of to kind of bring that bring that full circle and just get a really cool opportunity to work on something that really does have such a big impact for US citizens. Because I think that also kind of encapsulates why a lot of people, whether they're a direct civil servant, a contractor, a consultant, work on these issue sets is they really care. They care about the US citizens, they care about these issues, and they want to make the world a little bit better.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better.
Well, we do have one quick rapid fire
Yes.
section. If you could use one word or phrase to describe international religious freedom, what would it be?
Transformational.
Um,
And I'll use some lyrics to explain what that means. I'm going to go back to the 90s. There's a female R&B group
yeah.
in Vogue, and they said free your mind and the rest will follow. And that's probably what I'm going to be known for now. But the reason
Just
why
that little clip.
the reason why that plays in my mind over and over is, to me, religious freedom is really about freedom of conscience.
Yeah.
And governments, no matter how hard they try, they can't force you to think and believe something in
No.
your heart, in your mind. Once you have full freedom of conscience, I feel like everything else follows from that. That's why that phrase, free your mind and the rest will follow. Whether you have freedom of speech, whether you have, freedom to gather with others and pursue similar beliefs and values and objectives. And so I think that's the piece that I think I would hope is a takeaway when people learn about religious freedom today, is that it's really about starting with that freedom of conscience. And then I think if you see it that way, you kind of see where this particular freedom really relates to
Yeah.
everything else.
No, I think that's really really beautiful. Um, wow, thank you so much for listening to the Head of the Table podcast this week. To summarize, find your really stick to your principles. Really find your whether you call it your North Star, your vision, your principles. As a leader, it's really important for you to kind of identify not only what you want your vision to be, but the vision that you have for those that you're leading. And as much as the world can throw a lot of curveballs your way, I think staying in that space of learning, of growing, of being open, having an open mind, and engaging with as many people as possible ultimately will serve you as a leader. And so I'm really glad that we could have Sameer Hossain here to talk with us kind of about that and, kind of talk about the transformations that we're going through.
Absolutely. It's we're all one big community here supporting each other. And it's been fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And where can people find you?
So if you look on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, just search for the Pathfinder Pod. There's also a link from my website, pathpolicy.com, and you can follow along. Mine's a monthly podcast. I'm not as fast and furious as Nora, which is impressive, but the idea is to kind of just have this steady drumbeat of here's what drives me and motivates me, and hopefully we can have conversations based on that. And looking forward to having you on my podcast.
Yeah, I would love to join. We'll make sure to link all of that in the show notes, and also it'll appear magically on the screen. If you're interested in following along for the Head of the Table podcast, we're on Instagram, TikTok. You can kind of see the behind the scenes. We also now have a LinkedIn page, so you can jump in, talk about kind of the issues that we're talking about on the podcast. And also, you can check out my website. It's norariddlecoaching.com. I am offering a special October 29th group session, kind of looking at career pivots. I know a lot of people, whether they're impacted by, the layoffs in the public sector, the private sector, or simply looking to navigate this economy right now, I'm doing a group session to kind of help you figure out what are your transferable skills and take away a step by step roadmap to how you can take that next step in your career. Thanks so much.